Good evening and welcome to a Transport Premise Symposium. This evening we are pleased to have with us Dr. Alan Lewis. He is a nationally certified rehabilitation counselor, tenured professor, and has been since 2016 our Dean of the College of Health Professions at Downstate Health Sciences University in Brooklyn. He is a health services researcher with emphasis in disability services. He has more than 35 years of work experience as a clinician, educator, and academic administrator. He has been a faculty member of 4 universities. His main area of interest is in understanding how culture impacts the disability experience. He's a recognized expert in disability disparities and is the former editor of the Journal of Applied Rehabilitation Counseling. Beyond his more than 75 publications, he has written one book. He's delivered over 150 invited and refereed national, international, regional, statewide, and local presentations. I am going to give him an intro a little bit later. I will introduce him to you. But before that, I'd like to share with you that we're also joined by Dr. Tracey Wilson, who is the Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs and Research for the School of Public Health. And we will be joined later by, uh, by Dr. Carla Boutin-Foster. And so I hope you all will enjoy this presentation. Thank you so much for coming this evening and enjoy. Okay, so Dr. Alan Lewis, you may proceed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Straker, for that very gracious and generous introduction. And greetings to everyone, and thank you for joining our conversation today on the topic of cultural bias, race, and the Black experience in the United States. As Dr. Straker said, I'm Alan Lewis, Dean of the School of Health Professions here at SUNY Downstate Health Sciences University. Before I get going, I'd like to offer thanks to the NIH Transport Grant PIs, President and Dr. Wayne Riley and Dr. Moro Salafu. Also like to thank Dr. Carla Boutin-Foster and Dr. Tracey Wilson, as well as the PREMIS team, Dr. Pamela Straker, Ms. Lakia Maxwell, Ms. Nancy Ruiz-Torchon. Thank you very much. And what I'll plan to do today is really spend about 40 minutes or so providing some commentary, and then we'll have an opportunity for the conversation to really start. Let me say at the outset that everything I say today is really my opinion. It has nothing to do with the view of either SUNY as a system or Downstate or the School of Health Professions. And because we are an academic community, feel free to disagree with me. So thank you, and let's get going. So at the outset, I want to say that much of what I'll say today, probably 90% of what I'll say, comes from my 2014 book, We Are All Racist, The Truth About Cultural Bias, which I'm holding up now. It's a pretty small book. It's just over 100 pages, but it's packed with a lot of information. So I encourage you to take a look at it if you have a chance. Again, We Are All Racist, The Truth About Cultural Bias. So let me say that I wrote this book actually in about 2 weeks, believe it or not, in the summer of 2013, in the hot July of 2013, while I was actually attending a national AAU basketball tournament in Orlando, Florida, with my then 16-year-old son, who was participating in that tournament. And the reason I wrote it then, though I had many thoughts about the content of the book, but that was sort of the sweet spot that allowed me to have the motivation to actually write it. And I was so unprepared that I didn't have even a laptop. So I was writing this book on hotel pads and using pencils and pens from the hotel. But at that time, the impetus and the catalyst for me to write the book was that literally 45 minutes away from where we were at that basketball tournament in Orlando, in Sanford, Florida, the George Zimmerman trial was actually underway for the death of Trayvon Martin. And the reason that particular trial really impacted me, outside of obvious reasons, but the thing about it is that the media coverage for that particular trial was interesting. And the one thing I kept noticing was that the media kept mentioning how surprised they were that race was still a significant factor in United States society in 2013. And my thought was, of course it is, because I think race will always be a factor in our society. And that really prompted me to start writing the book that I thought about, obviously, a lot up until that point. So my first inquiry about race was at the age of about 4 or 5, when I asked my mother, for a period of about 1 week, as she was giving me my nightly bath, I kept saying, "Mom, wash me clean." And my mother at the time was a kindergarten teacher. And so she was used to sort of random chatter with kids. So at first, the first few times I said it, she said she didn't really, as I'm hearing her tell this story years later, she didn't really make much of it because that's what little kids do. And finally, I said it so much, she said, "What do you mean wash you clean? Of course I'll wash you clean every time you're in the bathtub." And she said, my response was, "No, wash me clean like the kids in the movie The Sound of Music." You may remember those Von Trapp kids. And so that was my first really preliminary conversation about race. And I didn't know enough about it to really understand that it wasn't a matter of cleanliness. It was just a difference in the skin color. And so that was my first sort of entree into this concept of race and ethnicity and differences across people. When I speak of race in this book, I'm not speaking solely of race in the traditional sense. We all know that racism in the traditional sense is a phenomenon that most historians and probably sociologists agree that can only be perpetrated by groups of power. So I mean racism from that perspective, but I also mean racism in a very prominent way as one type of cultural bias. As my title of my book suggests, we're all racist, the truth about cultural bias. So I'm really talking a lot about race as a cultural bias dimension. Of course, we know there are at least 4 types of racism. There's interpersonal racism. And before I go into those 4 types, let me back up for a minute and just say that the concept of race, I'm reminded from my colleague at Virginia Commonwealth University, I think she's actually retired now, but sociologist Dr. Audrey Smedley has written quite extensively on race, and she talks about race as being social construction and not biology. As a matter of fact, one of her most recent writings is titled "Race as Biology is Fiction, but Race as Social Construction is Real." And so we all often talk about race, but race is really a misnomer. It's really phenotype that we should be talking about. Phenotype really speaks to, it's the biological term that speaks to the differences that we're talking about when we talk about race. Differences in hair texture, differences in facial features, skin hue. Those are really factors that relate to phenotype. And race is really much more a term that's socially loaded based on the history of wherever the term is being used. And in our country, we know a lot about that history. So when I'm saying race, I probably should be saying ethnicity or nationality because those terms are probably much more appropriate. But like most folks, I say race a lot because we're so accustomed to doing it. So again, back to the 4 types of racism. There's interpersonal racism, and that's racism where one group feels superior to another group based solely on their race or ethnicity or their nationality. And racism really is the feeling of extreme ethnocentrism, where you really take it from a point of being prideful in your group to a point of really feeling like your group is really superior to all other groups. So there's interpersonal racism that occurs between individuals on a one-to-one basis. There's also internalized racism. That's racism that occurs when a group has been subjected to a lot of racism and oppression and disenfranchisement over a period of time, so much so that the recipients of the racism really begin to believe the messages of inferiority. And that has happened a lot in the Black community over the years. We've internalized the racism so that we, as a community, sometimes feel we're less than, or at least used to historically. There's also institutional racism and systemic racism. Institutionalized racism is racism that's sort of inherent in institutional operations. I'll give you a quick example. When I was applying for undergraduate schools back in the late 1970s, I applied to University of Virginia, which is where I ultimately ended up going. And they had an admissions standard back then called the legacy policy. And that meant that if you had a parent who attended the University of Virginia, and I'm sure a lot of schools do this, but if you had a parent that attended the University of Virginia, you get bonus points in your admissions profile. Well, when I was applying in 1979, it would have been impossible for me to have actually had a parent who attended the University of Virginia, because the University of Virginia only admitted Blacks and women in appreciable numbers in the undergraduate programs starting in 1971. So it would not have been possible for me to have actually had a parent who could have gone to the University of Virginia. So that's an example of institutionalized discrimination or institutionalized racism. Systemic racism really speaks to racism that occurs across institutions, within systems in society. And there are lots of examples of that, such as redlining, police over-policing Black communities, the existence of food deserts in Black communities, especially food options that are healthy. You don't find many places like Whole Foods and Trader Joe's in the poorest communities. Things like police profiling, all those are examples of systemic racism. Redlining, I think I mentioned already. These are all things that happen, and they're phenomena that occur across systems that really do put certain groups at a disadvantage. So when we talk about cultural bias, in my mind, race is just one dimension of culture. There are many different dimensions of culture, such as spirituality, gender identity, sexual orientation, political affiliation. Clearly, a Republican, a Democrat have a different worldview. Socioeconomic status can be a dimension of culture as well, depending on where you are on that rung. Profession, we know that physicians and engineers probably approach the world differently. So when I talk about culture, what I'm really speaking of is those traditions, those assumptions, those values, those ways of living, a certain worldview that's synonymous with a group. And culture is a dimension that both ties people together within a particular cultural orientation, and it separates them, distinguishes them across cultures. Race is the dimension of culture that we have really had a preoccupation with in this country, primarily for two reasons. One, because of the slavery experience. And we all know that the slavery experience, which was about 250 years in this country, from about 1607 to 1865. And we know that that experience in terms of race was the defining factor in terms of determining who was oppressed and who the oppressors were. And so that's one reason that America has a preoccupation with race. The other reason is because race, of all the cultural dimensions there are, race is the one that's most visible. Race is probably the only cultural dimension, or one of few, where you can see somebody, not say anything to the person, not interact with the person, but just based on a visual inspection of the person, make a determination of what race or ethnicity or nationality you think that person is. You may not be correct in your determination, but you certainly think you can make a judgment based on physical attributes. And so because of race or ethnicity is more visible, and because of the slavery experience in this country, the United States is really preoccupied with that concept. But we clearly know there are other dimensions of culture beyond just race and ethnicity. Let me talk a little bit about culture, about bias. Bias is a term that speaks to a preference or a like or dislike. And not all biases really are dangerous. Some are innocuous and innocent. For example, I'm ashamed to admit, but I'm a diet soft drink consumer, and I prefer Diet Pepsi over Diet Coke, although I drink plenty of Diet Coke because sometimes Diet Pepsi is not available. But my preference for Diet Pepsi versus Diet Coke really is a pretty innocent bias, unless you think I drink enough Diet Pepsi to impact the bottom line of Coke and you're a Coke stockholder. Then you may think it's not so innocuous, but for the most part, who cares, right? But there are other types of biases that people have that are much more dangerous and more high stakes in terms of their nature. Biases that people have if you don't like a particular culture of people or particular group of people who are defined by their religious orientation. Those biases can be particularly problematic, particularly if you're a provider of services. So bias in and of itself is just a preference or dislike. It may or may not be dangerous, but oftentimes it is. And in our context, when we talk about cultural bias, we're typically talking about an unfair judgment based primarily on one of those cultural dimensions. And in the United States, it typically is race or ethnicity. Bias as a concept is one in which there probably are at least a half a dozen theories on where bias comes from, the etiology or the origin of bias. I can tell you, I'll share a couple theories with you. One is the theory of relative deprivation that I'm sure many of you have heard of. And it speaks to the fact that if you have two groups that are different culturally, sometimes they have bias towards one another because the groups perceive that the one group perceives that the other group has a bigger piece of the American pie, maybe has more economic power, more social status, more opportunity, whatever it may be. So it doesn't have to be a real phenomenon, but it just has to be a perceptual phenomenon where one group views another group as having more access to things in our society. And so that theory of relative deprivation is one theory that speaks to why groups that are different culturally have bias. Another theory would be social learning theory, and many of us have heard of Albert Bandura and this theory. And it speaks to when a child is born and is learning as a toddler in the natural familial context. The biggest influence on that child will be the people around the kid, the parents, the siblings. And what happens is those adults will pass on to that child their own biases. And so through social learning and through affiliation, children sometimes learn biases in the nurturing process as they grow and develop from infants on up to toddlers and on up to, through the child process, latency, and up through adolescence and into adulthood. And then there's another theory that you may be familiar with called the ethnocentrism theory, which really is the theory that speaks to having a lot of pride in one's group. But we know that ethnocentricity taken to an extreme can become racism and can become bias against another group. So those are just three sample theories that speak to why it is that groups that differ culturally can have bias against each other. Okay, let's talk briefly about human beings interface with difference, in our case, cultural difference. So I want to talk about two mechanisms. I want to talk about cognitive schemas and subjective reality. So many of you will remember developmental psychologist Piaget. And Piaget did a lot of work on cognition. And he came up with this concept called cognitive schemas. Cognitive schemas really are the categories in our brains that speak to what things are in the world based on physical dimensions. So going back to my child example, when a child is born and begins to walk and begins to explore the world as a toddler, you notice that almost all kids ask a lot of questions. What is this? What is that? And as their parents and the other significant others begin to tell them what things are, these categories in their brain for what these objects actually are begin to form. And so a child may say, they point to a chair and say, what is that? And the parent says, well, that's a chair, or that's a table, or that's a ball, or that's a door. As the child moves about his or her life and develops, those categories form in their brain. And as they experience another object that looks like that schema or that category becomes more crystallized. And over time, these things become the categories that go with what these objects actually are based on their physical attributes. And we know that schemas are difficult to change because as a child moves forward and sees a chair that looks a little different, the child won't say that's not a chair, but the child will say, well, that's an odd chair or a funny looking chair. Because the schemas, once they're formed, they have begun to be crystallized a little bit in our heads, become strong, and we're not likely to change them unless something dramatic we experience something that's very different from what we've ever seen before. And Piaget talks about this process of assimilation, which is a functional invariant process, meaning it doesn't vary across people, and that we tend to fit a lot of things, physical things we experience in the world, into our existing categories in our brains, existing schemas, because that's a little more efficient, and our bodies are all about efficiency, especially our brains. And we all know that that our bodies really engage in homeostasis, which means they want to be stable and they want to try to resist change as much as possible. So these categories really do speak to what things are in terms of their physical attributes. What is an object? And we have a lot of stimuli in our world. So we have lots of schemas in our heads. And the reality is that if we didn't have these schemas, these cognitive schemas, we wouldn't be able to function because we would literally have to experience every object in our space anew every time we encounter it. And thank goodness we have schemas because we don't have to do that. When we see something that we know what it is, and because we have a schema that says this is what this is. But it's all based on physical attributes, and it all happens subconsciously in our brains, based on Piaget's work. Sometimes we develop new schemas because once in a while you'll see an object you've never seen before, and then that process is called accommodation, where your brain has to actually develop a new schema or modify dimensions that may be there already for an existing schema. And these two processes, assimilation and accommodation, these functional invariants in our brains really do balance out in a process called equilibration, as Piaget calls it. So the schemas really are important in how we get through life, but they also speak to the fact that many times we function on autopilot and we just judge things based on the physical attributes, based on past experience. In other words, a schema that's already in our head. Now let's shift and talk a little bit about subjective reality. So subjective reality speaks to what, once we know what something is based on its physical attributes in terms of it being a schema already in our heads, subjective reality speaks to what is this thing? What does it mean to us? What does our experience say this is? And how do we interpret this object? So on the one hand, the schema tells us what an object is. On the other hand, subjective reality says what this thing is in terms of its meaningfulness to us. What does it mean to us based on our life experience? So I'll give you an example that will distinguish these two concepts. So I'm going to hold up now a flag. And if I hold this flag up, I'm willing to bet it's a Confederate flag. If I hold this flag up, hopefully you can see it. I'm willing to bet that almost every adult in the United States of America can tell you that this is a Confederate flag. You know why? Because in large societies like ours, we have common enough experiences where we have some similar schemas for things like flags. The United States flag we can all identify for the most part, and the Confederate flag because it's a flag we've seen before and we all pretty much know what it is. So that's the schema piece. We identify this flag based on the configuration of colors, stripes, and stars as being a Confederate flag. Now, if I then said, what does the flag mean? And asked a large group of folks, I'm willing to bet, particularly if they're different culturally, that you'll get some different ideas on what the flag means. Some may say the Confederate flag means pride or Southern heritage, particularly if they're from the South. Some may say, no, it means racism or oppression. If you're a Black person, you may think that. So that's an example of how the Confederate flag, we can all have the same schema for it because we have a similar schema for flags, but what it means, the subjective reality, is very different depending on the person's life experience. Here's another example. Here's a picture of a wheelchair. It's kind of small, you may not be able to see it, but this is a wheelchair. So if I hold up a picture of a wheelchair, again, within the United States, I'm willing to bet that most people can identify it as a wheelchair. But if I went into the locker room and asked a professional football team, what does the wheelchair mean to them? I'm willing to bet that most of those players would say it means confinement and would not have a positive interpretation of a wheelchair. But if I went to a rehabilitation hospital and I went to a floor where they have individuals who have mobility impairments, and I said, what does the wheelchair mean to you? It may mean freedom, because it may mean that's an opportunity for them to actually be able to ambulate and get around independently if you have a mobility impairment or spinal cord injury, for example. So you can see how that same object, although we may have some consensus on what it is based on the schemas, the subjective reality is very different based on one's life experience and one's perspective. And that's why it's called subjective reality. So schemas and subjective reality really help us deal with differences, particularly cultural differences in our life space. And they come together, but the problem is that they function on a subconscious level. So most folks are functioning on autopilot, not questioning their schemas, not questioning their subjective reality. So we're just jumping to conclusions based on what our schemas and subjective reality, which is our past experience, tells us about things. And that's how stereotypes start. And stereotypes really are a very natural process. And stereotypes are not a bad thing. Stereotypes really are true for a small group of people that they were developed based on. So if I've only met 10 people from the country of Finland, and all 10 of those people are 8 feet tall, then I'm going to begin to expect that all of those people from Finland are 8 feet tall, because that's a small sample, and I begin to generalize that to the whole population. But the problem with the stereotype is that it fails because it's not generalizable to the entire population. It's true for a sample, typically a small sample, but it doesn't generalize to the population. Again, schemas and subjective reality help us form those stereotypes. So it's a very natural human process that we have to interrupt to make sure that we are consciously aware of the things that we're being exposed to in terms of stimuli in our environments, particularly if we want to be culturally aware. Okay, now enough about cultural bias and racism. Let's move into a little bit of the part of a conversation that deals with the Black experience in the United States. So in my book, I I state that the Black community provides a key exemplar for understanding the impact of racism and race as a cultural bias on a specific US-based cultural group. Obviously, there's no one who can truly speak on behalf of an entire community. There's no monolithic voice out there that really can be authoritative, but I did it anyway because that's what you do when you write a book. When you write a book, it's just you speaking, you do research, you might cite others, but it's really your voice and your perspective that comes to bear in a book when you write it. So as we begin to think about the Black experience in the United States, let's look at history a little bit as a backdrop to give us a little bit of context. And I'm talking about history that dates back to immediately after the Civil War, 1865, up until about now. So what we see when we look back at the history, that's about 156 years or so. But when we look back, we see a pattern of historical patterns of Black advancement and white backlash over that time period. And I will say that Lerone Bennett Jr., former editor of Ebony, and also author of the book Before the Mayflower in 1962, was probably one of the first historians to identify these patterns of advancement, Black advancement and white backlash from the Reconstruction period right after the Civil War all the way up until to at least the Civil Rights era and beyond, arguably. So let's look at these periods. So from 1865, which the Civil War ended, to 1882 was considered to be the first Reconstruction period in the United States, also known as a time of Black advancement. During this period of time, the Freedmen's Bureau was created to help newly freed slaves. There was at least a promise of 40 acres and a mule, although it was never fully actualized. Black political activism was at a very high level. There were at least a dozen Black US congressmen in the South during this time period. There were several hundred state level congressmen in the South during this period of time. In 1869, the 15th Amendment actually gave Black men the right to vote. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1875 that afforded protection to Blacks in transportation, restaurants, hotels, theaters, and jury duty. And so that was a period of 1865 to 1882 where the country sort of realized, both Black people and white people, that there was a need to support Black advancement. And that's why these activities were allowed to happen. But then something changed. In 1883, there was a court case that really begun to question the 1875 Civil Rights Act and really said that that act only applied to government supported conveyances. And we know that at that time, there were very few government-sponsored conveyances, transportation and those types of things. And so it meant that you could still discriminate on the private side. Also, in 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson case happened, and that really did begin, I should say, usher in a time when separate but equal, or segregation, was the rule of the day, starting in 1896, and that was to flourish for another almost 60 years. And by the year 1900, the Ku Klux Klan had killed 1,000 Black folks in the South in the United States. In the separate but equal Jim Crow era was to continue all the way up until 1954, when the Brown decision occurred. So that second period, which we call the white backlash, was from 1883 all the way to 1953. And during that period of time, the sentiment of the white population was that they were threatened, that we wanted to oppress these folks that earlier, in the previous advancement period, we would have support for them moving ahead. But the sentiment somehow changed. And then in 54, we had a new period of advancement that really started with the Brown decision and the Montgomery bus boycotts and Rosa Parks did her thing to kick all that off. And then the Civil Rights era started, and which was a period of Black advancement. JFK created affirmative action in 1961 with an executive order that created the EEOC. So that was the first example of affirmative action. In 64, we know there was a Civil Rights Act. In 65, another Voting Rights Act. And by then, the Civil Rights movement was in full swing. And this continued into the 70s. But we know that as we reached 1978, we hit another period where there was white backlash. And in 1978, what happened was there was a court case. You may remember Alan Bakke. Alan Bakke was an applicant to the University of California Medical School at Davis. And he applied and was rejected and did some research and found out that he had a higher medical school benchmark score than some of the Black applicants who were actually admitted. And so he claimed reverse discrimination. That was the first time we heard that term, reverse discrimination. And he essentially won that case at the United States Supreme Court. And then that began to sort of question affirmative action and began to dismantle quotas from that point forward. Immediately following the Bakke case in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected. And Ronald Reagan had 2 terms. And Ronald Reagan was a very conservative president. He really was into states' rights and the new federalism. And then, so that was at that period from 78 to probably 1993, because we had the 2 Reagan presidencies, and then we had the first Bush presidency. That was probably a period of white backlash, less support for Black and minority advancement in this country. And so I actually did a study when I was an undergraduate at the University of Virginia, where I actually looked at these periods of advancement and backlash. And I looked at them from the perspective of the views held by both Black and white Americans in both time periods by reviewing editorials in an all Black and all white newspaper in each of those time periods. The first Black advancement period, the first Reconstruction, the first white backlash period, 1883 up until 1954, and then the Civil Rights era, which is Black advancement, and then starting with the Bakke decision through Ronald Reagan's period. I was at that point, I had to stop because it was 83, and I was, the history couldn't go any farther than that, because that's the year that it was that I actually did the study. But I looked at these editorials in these Black and white newspapers, and I could see evidence of the prevailing views of both Black folks and white folks and how they shifted during these periods of time. And I knew this by looking at both use of language and argument structure in the editorials, doing what is called as a rhetorical analysis, when you look at discourse and really analyze what people are saying based on how they say it. And I was able to conclude that, yes, the dominant sentiment within both the Black and the white populations changed as these periods advanced. In the advancement periods, both Blacks and whites were supportive of Black advancement. In the backlash periods, whites were not as supportive, obviously, and were in some ways threatened and wanted to hold Black folks back. So as we go forward beyond the second backlash period, from 78 to 93, which takes us through the first George Bush presidency, the question is, are these cycles continuing to repeat themselves as we go forward? You tell me. The Bill Clinton presidencies could be considered a third period of advancement for minorities and Blacks. And then you have the second Bush, who had 2 presidencies, and you could say maybe that was a period of backlash because he was very conservative, and he received a lot of flack for how he handled the Hurricane Katrina situation for minority communities. And then after the second Bush had his 2 presidencies, we had the Obama presidencies. And that could arguably be considered to be a period of advancement for minorities and persons of color. And then after Obama, we had Trump. And obviously that's a period of backlash. And now we have Biden. So is that another period of advancement? Who knows? You decide. But the point is, if you look at over the last 156 years, from the end of the Civil War up until about now, we can see these periods of Black advancement and white backlash in a cyclical way happening pretty frequently. And so that's sort of the context that we've lived in over the last century and a half. So all communities in the United States that have been disenfranchised due to their ethnicity have experienced trauma from that oppression and have some healing to do, in my opinion. That includes not only Black folks, but it includes First Nations people. Obviously, the United States was stolen from them. They were here before anybody else. And then another example of oppression was the Wounded Knee Massacre for that group. And then, of course, Chinese Americans, the Exclusion Act of 1882, and then restricted immigration, and it was an attempt to make sure the workforce in this country was purely white. We have the Japanese Americans internment camps after World War II. Arabs after 9/11 were discriminated against, and other groups in this country. But I would say that the repression that the Black community has experienced is probably far more sustained and long-term than any other group in this country. The Black population is sustained 246 years of chattel slavery where you consider property, 71 years of Jim Crow racism and discrimination, and then several cycles of this Black advancement and white backlash, all of which had the cumulative of traumatizing the Black community. And therefore, I think some of the trauma is still evident today. Even in 2013, when I wrote the book, it was, I think, even more evident than maybe it is today. So I think there's some healing that Black communities still could benefit from based on those several centuries of trauma that we've experienced in this country. You don't just get over that kind of trauma that fast. And if anybody knows anything about post-traumatic stress disorder, you know that trauma is very, very strong and very deep-rooted. So there are a couple of things that I think patterns you see in the Black community that speak to the evidence of the trauma in my estimation. First, in the Black community, we're now about 67 years post the Brown decision. And I think there is this pervasive, at least there was in 2013 when I wrote the book, a pervasive sense of progress. And I think that sense of progress is not entirely true. I think it's as much progress as we think. There has clearly been progress in this country. Clearly things are far better in our lifetimes than they were in the lifetimes of our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents in this country. But things are not all well. And that's what I'm talking about. I think that there are many pockets of the Black community that think that, you know, things are fine now. We've got a fair number of entertainers and athletes who are millionaires, and even Oprah's a billionaire. And we've had two presidencies with a Black president in terms of Obama. And so I think there's been this love sense of things are okay now, up until 2013 at least. I know in the last couple of years, we've had a lot of social and racial unrest, so that may not be the case now, but up through 2013, probably through 2015, easily you can make the argument that the Black community had this love sense of complacency, that everything is fine now. We had Obama in the White House, we got Black millionaires, we're doing well. And then the second symptom, I think, is narcissism. The sense that every person for him or herself, a weak sense of community, a weak sense of communalism, which is sort of the bedrock of the Black community in terms of the whole experience we had in Africa and coming over. Our community was always strong. And I think part of the evidence you see for that is this sense of excessive violence in Black communities, high degree of Black on Black crime. You look at Chicago for the last 5 years or so. Look at what's happening in New York City right now, this year. Christopher Lasch wrote a book in 1979 called The Culture of Narcissism, American Life in an Age of Diminishing Expectations. He's a cultural historian, and he talks about the fact that all of United States society has become very narcissistic, very much driven by individualism, and obsessed with everybody doing their own thing, the person for her or himself. And I think we have that also in the Black community. Another symptom, I think, would be the preoccupation that I think Black community has with immediate gratification, which is exacerbated by excessive spending. Based on data that I looked at when I did my book, this would be 2012 data, so it's almost a decade old, but if you look at the data recently, it hasn't changed. Blacks are 13% of the total population of this country. In 2012, Blacks spent 30% more than the other 80% of the population. The spending of 13% of the population in 2012 was 30% more than the other 80% proportion of our population in this country. In 2015, the Black community had $1 trillion in spending power and no real wealth, no understanding about how to generate wealth. Evidence, during that same period of time, white families have twice the income of Black families, but more importantly, white families have on average 6 times the wealth of Black families. So it's not as, there's a disparity in terms of income, but the wealth generation is really lagging in terms of the Black community not being on par with the white community. Also, Black companies, Black businesses are 5% of the population, and 2%, and only 2% of those are businesses that have more than one employee. So by and large, Black businesses are single employee businesses. And then the dollar, white businesses, for every dollar that a white business makes, Black businesses earn 43 cents. So 43 cents on the dollar, Black business versus a white business. Other minority groups earn more than Blacks do in terms of their businesses. 56 cents on the dollar for Asians, Latinos, and First Nations people, 59 cents on the dollar that whites make for Pacific Islanders. So the further evidence of this preoccupation with immediate gratification would be in terms of the types of things that the Black community spends money on. Part of I think the psyche is that we want to look to part of success. We've been oppressed for so long that we want to look to part of success, and therefore We purchase things that give us the look of success, the trappings of success, cars, clothes, jewelry, things that have no real value going forward. You can look at spending patterns and see the types of things that Black folks spend money on, as opposed to things that really do have investment potential that can grow over time, property, land, investment. And that's changing, but up until 2013, we could still see some stark differences there. And the last symptom, I think, is if you think about who's the leadership in the Black community, it used to be a time you'd have to ask that question. We knew who the Black leaders are. Who are the Black leaders today? You could make an argument about who they are, but there's not really a consensus. You could say, well, maybe it's Al Sharpton, maybe it's those three ladies who started Black Lives Matter, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cruz, or Opal Tometi, Cornel West, Barack Obama, Jesse Jackson. Who is it? There's really no consensus on who the Black leaders are today. So if you're not convinced that there's no parity between the Black and white community, let's take a look at the data. I looked at data in my book when I wrote that. I looked at 11 different indices, social indicators. And so I revisited those since that was 2013 and this is 2021. I said, let me look at those data again to see what the patterns are. And the patterns haven't changed. So let's talk about those for a minute. So life expectancy. In the Black community, life expectancy is 72 years. In the white community, 78 years, based on 2020 data from the US Bureau of Vital Statistics. Poverty rate. In the Black community, the poverty rate is 18.8%. It's 7.3% in the white community, based on 2020 data from the Urban Institute. The rate of homelessness. In the Black community, there are 55 homeless people per 10,000 in the population. In the white community, there are 11 homeless people per 10,000 in the population. That's based on the National Alliance to End Homelessness data from 2020. Unemployment rate. In the Black community, right now, it's 11.4%, 7.3% in the white community, based on 2020 data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. High school dropout rate. In the Black community, 6.4% in 2018 and 5.2% in the white community. So not a huge difference there. 4-year high school graduation rate, 79% in the Black community, 89% in the white community. Again, not a tremendous difference, but noticeable difference. And that's based on 2017 and 2018 data from the National Council of Educational Statistics. The college graduation rate, 37% in the Black community, 67% in the white community, twice as much. 2018 data from the National College of Educational Statistics. Teen pregnancy rate, and this is teen pregnancies among 15 to 19-year-olds. It's 27.5 pregnancies per 1,000 people for Blacks, 13.2 pregnancies per 1,000 people for whites, based on 2017 data. Cancer incidence, 956 cases per 100,000 people in the Black community, 943 cases per 100,000 people in the white community. Not a huge difference, but a noticeable difference. Cancer mortality, deaths from cancer, 228 people per 100,000 in the Black community, 190 people per 100,000 in the white community. These are data from the 2015 through the 2019 year from the United States, from the American Cancer Society. Diabetes incidence, 11.7% in the Black community, 7.5% in the white community, based on 2018 data from the American Diabetes Association. Incarceration rates. In the Black community, there are 1,500 Blacks in jail per 1,000 adults in the population. And that's down from 2,200 just a few years back. In the white community, there are 268 people in jail per 100,000 in the population. So 1,500 per 100,000 in the Black community incarcerated versus 268 per 100,000 in the white community. And again, we're talking about 13% of the population in the Black community. This is data from 2018 from the Pew Research Center. So obviously, we have some work to do still today in the Black community. So let me give you two quick stories that speak to the magnitude of the challenge that I think we're facing in terms of turning things around and truly reaching parity, Black community with the white community. And both of these stories are in my book. The first story is I titled it Wendys Gangbanger, Who Was Crazy, Him or Me? Wendys as in a fast food restaurant. So probably about 25 years ago, I was, at that time, I had my PhD. I was director of the Virginia State Cancer Registry. And I was out one day for lunch at a restaurant, Wendys, and I'm standing in line behind another young person, a young Black male. And of course, my schemas and my subjective reality, my biases kick in. This individual had his pants hanging down. He had a lot of bling on. He had some tattoos. He had all the things that I would associate with, people of his generation. And then he pulls out a wad of cash that literally was the size of a baseball easily, but it was compressed. And I thought that's easily $1,000, maybe $2,000, depending on what denomination those bills were. And so he looked like he was maybe late teens, early 20s. And so me and my biases, they kicked in and told me this guy's probably doing something for his livelihood that's not on the up and up. Probably a drug dealer is what I thought. And I'm standing behind him with $20 in my wallet with a PhD, and director of a statewide program in the health department, and driving a nondescript. He was also driving a very fancy car with huge rims and spinners and all that stuff. And I'm driving a nondescript Saturn, probably $20 in my pocket. And so I imagine what it would be like if me, close to 40, about 40 maybe, not quite 40 years old, could get this young man to sit down with me and we could have lunch and we talk about the choices he was making. This is all hypothetical because he didn't do it, but I'm envisioning what would I be able to say with all my years of training and education to really be able to convince this young man that the lifestyle he's leading, the path he's on, is not a good one. It leads to destruction. And I thought, I probably couldn't wage any cogent argument to get him to truly understand that what he was doing wasn't the right thing, that he could probably make a better choice. He would probably look at me and say, okay, look at how you're dressed. Look at what kind of car you drive. Show me how much money you have in your wallet. You want me, him talking to me, you want me to stop what I'm doing, making this fast money, and to go and devote how many years to getting a degree in school and then work to make $50,000 a year for a salary? And I'm thinking, yeah, so we'd have this conversation, and I can't legitimately really say that I could convince this young man based on the things I think I would say to him to be persuasive. I don't think I could convince him. The question is, would he convince me to follow his lifestyle? Who knows? And that's why I call it Wendys Gangbanger, who is crazy, him or me? But this story symbolizes, I think, the magnitude of the challenge, because we have got to get young people in urban areas to make better choices by the masses. And if we can't do that, then we can't change the data that we just talked about a little while ago. Second story, Taco Bell example, kids are so impressionable. That's the name of it. Of course, you see I like fast food restaurants. So this time I'm in a restaurant, Taco Bell, with my son, who was about 6 at the time, and one of his buddies who was also 6. And we're standing in line, again, behind another Black male, very similar to the one from the Wendys restaurant. Again, pulls out a wad of money, looks like about the size of a softball. I'm thinking, my goodness. And my son and his friend at 6 years old, they saw that and their eyes got this big. And they wanted to ask about it. And I said, I shut them down. So when we sat down at our table, some ways away from where that young man was. And also, by the way, he also made a statement out loud so everybody could hear him that he had enough money to buy everything on the menu for everybody in the restaurant 10 times over. So me and my son, both, and we're eating our Taco Bell food. And my son and his friend said, wow, that guy must have been rich. My son said, dang, he was rich, right? And I said, let me explain something to you fellas. I said, people who are truly rich, who are really wealthy, don't walk around with large sums of money in their pockets like that. If you're really wealthy, you have your money tied up in assets, investments, things. It's tied up. It's not liquid like that. And they didn't fully understand that, but at their age. But the point I was making was that he isn't wealthy. He's making fast money. But it didn't resonate with them, because at age 6, they could care less about the arguments I was making. All they knew is this guy had a wad of money the size of a softball. And that's why I titled this Kids Are So Impressionable, because what we see in many Black communities, particularly inner cities, is that kids have access to role models that are not all that positive. So they have role models on TV. Who do they see on TV that's successful? Entertainers and athletes. Okay, that's fine. But how many kids can really be millionaires from being an entertainer or athlete? So they see that. At least in the Obama presidency, they saw him if they watch that kind of thing. But they look outside their door, and who do they see? They see guys like this, wearing a lot of bling, pants hanging down, women on their arm, gun in their belt, big sums of money, driving cars or spinning rims, and that's what they aspire to. So that made me think, yes, young people are so impressionable. Between these two stories, it made me realize it's very sobering that we have a lot of work to do if we're really going to be able to turn this thing around. Okay, so let's move to solutions, and I'll be quiet and we can have some conversation. So in my book, I offer a multifactorial solution to advancing the Black community, 10 common sense strategies. Let me see if I can pull it up on the screen so you can see this. I call it the Black Triangle. Let's see if I can share my screen. And there it is. Okay, so in the book, I talk about the Black Triangle, 10 community self-help strategies for the 21st century. These are all strategies that the Black community would have to engage in self-help, not asking for anybody else to help, no affirmative action, not even reparations that Randall Robinson talked about in this book. Things the Black community can do to really begin to facilitate some positive change in our communities. And so you see this is a triangle, and you see I've got 10 strategies scattered. So on the very bottom of the triangle, which is the base, I've got 4 strategies that I move up to the next level, and then 2, 1 at the very top. Let's walk through these strategies and then I'm done. So first of all, first thing we have to do as a Black community is realize that race, although it's a big problem and a big cause of many of our problems, it's not a universal cause. Every problem that the Black community has is not due to racism. There are a lot of problems in the Black community. Not every one of them is racism. A lot of them are due to racism. So we gotta learn more discerning, figure out when things are due to racism and when things are due to our own shortcomings and failings. Over on this side, maximize education and training. This does not mean that everybody in the Black community needs to get a PhD. This means that whatever your profession is, you need to be optimally trained. If you're going to be a plumber, aspire to be a master plumber. If you're going to be an electrician, whatever the master level is for electricians, get the maximum education you can for whatever your particular profession is. Study Black history. We have Black History Month, but we still, by and large, as a community, don't know our history. I'm suggesting that everybody read Chancellor Fink's book, Destruction of Black Civilization. He wrote it, 2 editions, 1971 and 1987. Great book, speaks of all the accomplishments of Africans in the world before they were exposed to colonialism and imperialism, before Europeans went to Africa and did the pillaging that they did of the continent. So we got to become much more familiar with the successes and traditions and the contributions of persons of color around the world. And learn about money. We've got to learn about how to begin to generate wealth. Spending is one thing, but just spending doesn't mean a thing. We've got to generate wealth so we can begin to really build our communities going forward. Black folks need to read Black Enterprise more often. And I suggest this book called Millionaire Next Door by Stanley and Danko, in terms of learning about money and realizing that to become millionaires, you don't have to have a lot of money. 80% of the millionaires in this country are first generation, which means they didn't inherit their wealth. They learned how to make it from in their own lifetime. And so it's not how much you make, it's how much you make and how much you can keep and how you can make it grow. All right, next level up, support Black entrepreneurship. So on this side, we got to be thinking about owning businesses more. You heard me talk about that only 5% of the businesses in the country are Black owned, and 2% of those have more than one employee. So I already see evidence of this Black entrepreneurship in I have 2 kids, one that's just about 30 and one that's 23, and both of them are trying very hard not to work for anybody else. And I think they will be successful. When I came along, both of my parents were college educated, and I was socialized to think that you get as much education as you can, and then you go find the highest paying job you can find working for somebody else. We got to forget about that and start working for ourselves. Buy Black. Obviously, if we don't purchase and support Black businesses, nobody else will. I can remember back in 1988, I purchased furniture from a Black furniture store in Richmond, Virginia, and I knew very well that I was paying more for that furniture than I would have paid and a white establishment. But I was okay with that because I knew I was supporting a Black business. We got to be willing to do that same kind of thing going forward. Support Black institutions. I'm talking primarily institutions of educational institutions here, academic institutions. We got to do a better job of supporting HBCUs. I didn't do a good job of that. I went to University of Virginia. On my mother's side, she and her two siblings went to Norfolk State and HBCU. On my father's side, he and his two siblings went to Hampton University, back then Hampton Institute. I broke ranks and I probably should not have done that. We got to do a better job of supporting our Black institutions, particularly academic institutions. The next level up, I have two strategies, and these are very controversial, I'm told. The first one is marry within race. Now, this has nothing to do with racial purity. It has nothing to do with being against interracial marriages. As a matter of fact, when I came along, when I went to high school, when I went to college, I did a lot of interracial dating. But I was always very clear that my marriage decision would be and this is really more about economics. I think that Black folks, like other minorities and other groups in this country, like Jews do, like Asians do, try to keep the money in your community. So as we begin to do the things that are down here and begin to become more affluent as a community, we want to keep those dollars in the Black community. And one way you do that is to make sure that you make a marriage decision that's consistent with who you are in terms of your race and ethnicity. That's what this is all about. It has nothing to do with against other races, being against interracial marriages. None of that, because I participate in all those kinds of relationships in my life. But this is about a marriage decision, which is really an economic decision. Black gentrification. We got to get back to the cities. I was once a member of an all Black male investment club. There were probably 20 guys in the investment club, and at least 5 of them were millionaires. And they were from all walks of life. As a matter of fact, I had the most education. Most of them were blue collar type guys. But they had learned how to make money, and we were teaching each other about that. But one thing I noticed, we had a monthly meeting on Saturdays, and we always rotated those meetings and the members of the club hosted those meetings on a rotating basis. So we'd go to each other's houses. The one pattern I noticed the first year I was in the club was that almost without exception, every member of that club lived in the most expensive, suburban, almost all white subdivision or community they could afford. And I started thinking about that. And I said, there's something wrong with this picture, because these are hardworking Black men, 20 of us, blue collar, white collar, educated, uneducated, everybody's successful. As I said, there are 5 millionaires in the club. Everybody's successful in terms of finances. These are the role models that need to be in the city that these young kids that are impressionable, I talked about my 2 stories, could be inspired by. But the problem is, as soon as they have made enough money, they leave the city. They move out into the suburbs to these primarily white communities, the most expensive ones they can afford. What we got to do is, if you're already in that community, come back to the city. Or when you're in the city, when you become successful and make a lot of money, don't leave, because you've got to be a role model to those young kids right there. You got to be proximate to them. They got to be able to see you, talk to you, interact with you, and be influenced by you, so that the other negative role models can be neutralized and hopefully eliminated over time. So this is a very important strategy. And these 2 strategies take a lot of commitment, and I know a lot of folks are not going to do this marrying Black thing, but I felt an obligation to include it as a strategy, because I think it is a viable economic strategy if people can do it. Gentrification, probably not a lot of folks are going to not leave the cities or come back to the city. But if we can do it, it will make an amazing difference in terms of the proximity and availability of role models to people who need to see them in the cities. Okay, top of the pinnacle, financial strategy. I call it the 1-300 plan. So this is not about reparations. Randall Robinson talked about reparations in his book, The Debt, What America Owes Blacks, in 2001. And I agree with Randall. We are older, but the likelihood of it ever coming to fruition is very low. So what we need to do is do things on our own. And so this really is a strategy that really relates to pulling ourselves up by the bootstraps. So what this really is the top 1% of the most affluent Blacks in the United States devote 1% of their gross income once. So when I did this calculation in 2013, it was $3.1 billion. Then that $3.1 billion is divided among the top 300 most populous US cities in the country. And the reason I say most populous cities, that's cities that have a population of at least 100,000 or more, because we know that Black folks congregate in cities. We don't do a lot of rural living. So the 300 most populous cities in the US, those that have at least 100,000 population or more, would each get a portion of that $3.1 billion. That would end up being $10.3 million per city across those 300 cities. That means those cities could literally invest some of the money, but say they didn't invest it and it didn't grow. They only had $10.3 million per city across 300 cities. That would be $1 million per year that they could devote to Black education, training, and entrepreneurship for 10 years. I think that's a bolus dose of infusion of money that could help those communities. This strategy, in my estimation, is more probable than reparations, as I see it with Randall Robinson's proposal. It aligns with W.E.B. Du Bois. What he talked about was a concept of the talent of 10th. I call this the talent of 1%. That 1% of the most affluent Blacks in the U.S. donate 1% of their gross income one time to this pot of money. It also aligns with what George Washington Carver talked about in terms of pulling ourselves up by the bootstraps. It's just a theoretical concept, but I think if we address the logistics, I think this could work. Okay, so now you see my 10 community self-help common sense strategies, the Black Triangle. And with that, let's go back, let's start our conversation. And I'm ready for questions. I took a little more time than expected because it's 5 o'clock, sorry.
Okay, well, you've given us a lot to think about. And so we will start off the questions shortly. I'd like to just do a little housekeeping
Sure.
that I wasn't able to do before. First, I'd like to welcome Dr. Moro Salafu, who was not here at the beginning, but is here now. He is one of the PIs for the transport program. And I'd like to also just let you know that in future meetings, we will have the pleasure of having Dr. Marcus Lambert, who has recently been appointed the Associate Vice President for Research Strategy and Operations. So he will be with us as we move forward. I'd also like to acknowledge Lakia Maxwell, who is my colleague and who has worked endlessly for our success. She was away for a while and came back and really gave us a wonderful present. She had a new baby girl, and we've all been just enthralled. She's a new member of the family. And I'd like you also to use the chat to enter some questions, because Dr. Lewis has presented some very, very innovative, many of us have heard it before, some great ideas. And we'd like you to start to ask some questions about some of the things he shared. So before we get there, however, let me let Dr. Tracey Wilson start the questions.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Lewis. I really appreciated in your discussion today and in the book that you wove together in about 100 pages, the history, the complexity of bias and racism at different levels in our society, the psychological, interpersonal, institution, and policy levels. And also, I really appreciated that you contributed your own personal experiences and how they shaped your thinking and path in life. And so first, I just wanted to thank you for that. I really appreciated your talk today in the book. I also wanted to comment that I really appreciated your definition of health as including not just physical health, but social health, emotional health, and spiritual dimensions. And a question that I have for you, just to start us off, comes from this holistic public health perspective that I think you offered in terms of health in Black communities. And so In discussing sort of paths forward, you discussed community empowerment and community-driven solutions. You just presented us in terms of the Black Triangle with your vision of economic empowerment. And so thinking about health and well-being as pathways to, I think you're describing them to help repair and prevent the effects of cultural bias and racism. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about what the concepts of community empowerment and community-driven solutions means to you in terms of health and health disparities, and how you see those of us in the health professions contributing to this vision.
Okay, I just made a couple of notes there, Dr. Wilson. Thank you for all your comments. So yeah, and one of the things you noticed, Dr. Wilson mentioned some things that are in the book that I didn't mention in my talk because there's not enough time, but it is a packed 115 pages. So community empowerment and community-driven solutions for health disparities. So obviously the community is very important. And one of the things I talked about was the fact that we have lost a little bit of our communal spirit in the Black community. And I think we need to rededicate ourselves to being more connected across community so that we can really be able to affect more solutions. A group can do more than individuals. And so if we can put our resources together and work as a team within a community setting, then we can have much more of a synergistic impact. And so empowerment's very important. Empowerment's important in terms of, we've always talked about the Black community needing to be empowered and to be self-determining and to really decide its own destiny going forward. So empowerment is the first step in that self-determination. You got to feel like you have the resources and the ability to do that before you become self-determining. And in community-driven solutions, obviously, we have to impact all the data that I spoke to. Those 11 indices were all community-based social indicators, social economic indicators. So we've got to really address those things. A health disparity really is the concept of having differences in outcomes across communities based on cultural orientation, and having those differences be still evident even when we control for differences in affluence and socioeconomic status. You still see those differences. So we know that they're bias driven, either bias at the system level or bias at the provider level. And so, of course, we know that social determinants impact those and exacerbate those, but even if we didn't have social determinants, we still would see those disparities. So I think that the idea is that we've got to get communities involved. There's a lot more power in communities. We've got to get them empowered, as you said, so that we can really begin to affect change in terms of health disparities. And communities should be our unit of analysis. It should not be the individual. It should be how well is this community functioning as a totality, as a communal entity in terms of going forward to try to diminish those health disparities as a group. Healthcare providers have got to be engaged in community. One of the things we're doing in the School of Health Professions is we have a strong community engagement component, and we try to understand who our partners are in the community, and we try to make sure that we link with them and connect with them so that we can almost have this seamless system between the university and the community, where we all share the same visions and missions and work towards the same goals. And there are a lot of resources in the community, and the more we get the community involved, the more the community can help itself. Because I think the strategies that will help the Black community are not strategies that somebody else gives the community. I think the community itself needs to heal. And part of that healing process is to be actively involved in the healing, doing things for self to be self-determining, to be empowered, and to address our community's needs. And so I know I said a lot of things in a sort of a rambling way, but bottom line, I think community is the entity that we need to really focus on, because individuals can only do so much, but it's only when we come together and really focus on the sort of the macro perspective, what we can do as a big community, can we do things. You know, we do need to have strategies at all different levels. We need individual strategies, we need interpersonal strategies, we need organizational strategies, but we need community strategies, including policy strategies. I'm often thinking about the social ecological model, which speaks about if you're going to change anything, you have to have strategies at each of those 5 levels. You got to have strategies that each person is going to do differently. You got to have strategies that people and their relationships will do differently. That's the interpersonal level. And then you have strategies that organizations are going to do differently. And then you got to have strategies that the communities do differently. And the community is a collection of individuals and organizational entities all coming together. And then you got to have some policy changes. So obviously the community piece is very important. I know.
Thank you very much. Yeah, no, I really appreciated that. Thank you.
Dr. Salafu, do you have anything you'd like to ask?
First of all, I would like to thank you for organizing and being able to put the PREMIS programs together, you and Lakia. I also want to thank our speaker, Dr. Alan Lewis, for a wonderful review of a very touchy subject. This is a very important subject, and we can't actually finish talking about it because there's just so much around that subject. The PREMIS program, that is the President's Multi-Disciplinary Investigator Series, we designed it to improve communication between senior faculty and the community, with the hope that there will be community engagement in that regard. Plus, we will be able to expose our faculty, the junior faculty members, to potential research. That is, this is not just a conversation that ends, but the goal is that the conversation will trigger more questions, and then we would be able to, take some of the ideas and then put them into research, and then study them and see whether we can find solutions. That is one of the goals of the PREMIS series. But I have, a little comment regarding the talk itself, which is, what do you think is going to happen 100 years from now? In other words, there are two ways to do this, right? We can either have a more segregated, society or a more integrated society. So based on the models that you discussed, where do you think we're headed now? And what do you think would be the optimal?
So I think that based on the patterns that I'm seeing, I think we're 100 years from now, I think race will still be an important consideration. I don't think it's ever going to go away. I think it's race or something like that. Ethnicity will always be a dimension that that people will speak on. I do think we'll see a lot more blending of race.
A lot more blending, I see.
A lot more blending, because what's happening is, even though in my triangle, I suggested that at least within the Black community, people try to marry within their own group as an economic strategy. I think that what's really going to happen is nobody's going to do that, and particularly not young people. You love who you love, and you're going to marry who you want. And I think what's really going to happen is that 100 years from now, we'll have
a more perfect union.
Huh?
A more perfect union.
Right. I think people will look different. We'll have much more blending across ethnicity and nationality, and we'll have. I think race will still be a concern, because even within groups, race is a concern, or I should say differences in skin color. Even within the Black community, there's a pecking order based on complexion. Even within, and this, Dr. Salvo, even within African countries, there's always something that, whether it's social class, affluence or lack thereof, there's always a dimension that threatens us and that people feel divided by. So I don't think race is going to be, it's always going to be part of our landscape in this country, but I think the country will look a lot more different going forward, because we'll have a lot more racial intermarrying. We'll have a lot more people who have other sexual identities and gender identities more out and open. And I think the landscape will be, it'll be rich, it'll be pluralistic and very diverse, but it'll be different than the way it looks today. But I think some of the issues will still be there. There's always somebody on top, somebody on the bottom, and there's always this sense of relative deprivation. I'm in this group, and my group doesn't have what that group has. So we want more, and we don't like that group for that reason. So I think that's a human phenomenon, and I think we're always going to be at odds, unfortunately. Now, I love to be wrong, and maybe I am wrong, but I just feel like it's going to be a more of the same in terms of those challenges, but we'll look different as a society.
I have a question. So, but before I do that, Lakia, are there any questions from the audience?
Yes, we have three.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is, someone asked if you can rename the books that you mentioned.
Oh, the book.
The books that you mentioned.
You mean the books I mentioned? I think I mentioned.
Including yours.
mine is We Are All Racist, The Truth About Cultural Bias. I also mentioned Christopher Lash's book, The Culture of Narcissism, 1979. I mentioned Randall Robinson's book, The Debt, What America Owes Blacks. And I'm trying to think, that was in 2001. And I mentioned, I don't know what other books I mentioned, but I can certainly, I don't remember them all right now, but I don't think I mentioned Jawanza Kunjufu's book, Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys, but I had it on in my head as something I could bring up. I don't think I mentioned Nelson Mandela's book, No Easy Walk to Freedom, that he did in 1965 and again in 1990. So there are lots of potential books that I talked about throughout. And if anybody wants the specifics, they can certainly email me and I'll make that available.
Okay.
Let me just say, if you have any questions that you'd like to send to Dr. Lewis, please email us at Brooklyn Health Disparity Center. Use lakia.maxwell@downstate.edu, and we'll make sure that he gets that question. Before we go to the other two questions from the audience, Dr. Lewis, I have to tell you that some of the things that you talked about were quite interesting. I'm not sure I agree with you as to where we're going to wind up,
Right.
only because I am really feeling very good about the young people that I see coming along. I can't speak to the marrying Black, because I do think that's going to change, and that may be something healthy. But I think they are also thinking certainly in a much more entrepreneurial way. They are certainly supporting each other actually in a way that has not really existed before. So I'm seeing a lot of support of each other, and I'm seeing them having their heads on correctly. So I'm not sure I think it will all not happen, but I do think there is one thing that you didn't talk about, and that is the previous import of having major religious institutions that kind of kept the community together, that don't do that at this point. They had credit unions, they had all kinds of ways of teaching the community about a number of things. I don't think that they necessarily kept up with where our kids are at this point. So could you talk a little bit about where that may fit?
Sure, and I hope you're right, Dr. Straker, that the young people today will be able to do a much better job than young people in the past have done, and that things will be.
Well, we'll see, right?
We'll see. The jury's out on that. We'll see, and it would be great if we could be alive to see it for a long time. So we'll see. But in terms of the church, the Black church, the church has been a cornerstone in the Black community, and has been all things to all people in many respects throughout the generation. And I grew up in the Black church, and actually the topic of my next book has a little bit to do with the Black church, more religion than the church as a formal entity. So probably about 20 years ago, I noticed there was a trend in Black churches to build what they call these family life centers, and they were these centers that were all things to all people. They had credit unions, they had banks, they had social opportunities, they had exercise. I mean, they had everything. So it was like a full service community center within the Black church. They had counseling services, medical services, all those things. I do think that we're seeing less of that now, because I think churches now are moving away from the focus on bricks and mortar and building those kinds of institutions, and more on being more philanthropic and trying to put the money into the community rather than building these centers that draw people in. And so I think over time, the church is going to change. But I think it's still going to be a bedrock institution in the Black community, as it should be, because it's been a saving grace in many ways. I mean, where would the Black community be in this country without spirituality and the role of the church in terms of having sustained us throughout this whole time period from 1607 until now. So I don't expect that its role will diminish. I think it will morph over time, and we'll see less and less of the bricks and mortar type churches. It's just like now, people like my mother-in-law, who's just shy of 80 years old, is very enamored about going to church online and not having to put clothes on, and she still drive to church, and she loves it. And I think we're going to see much more of that going forward, because compliments of the pandemic, and there's always a silver lining from these things that happen that are negative, and so that's one of the silver linings. I think that we're going to move away from brick and mortar churches more to virtual churches. I think the role of the church will still be there. It'll still be very supportive and facilitative in Black community success, but I think it's going to look different.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to let the audience know that we are able to provide books to the first 15 people who email lakia.maxwell@downstate.edu. So if you send that email address to her, we need your email address and your address as to where we can send those books. So if you would do that, we will send you a book. Yes, there will be no charges for those first 15 people.
And I say also, Dr. Straker, that's the actual book for anybody who's tuned in today who wants me to send them a courtesy PDF copy of the book via email. I'm happy to do it. No charge.
Okay. Please let us know which one you would prefer. Lakia, you said there are 2 other questions.
Okay, the next question, the person asks, do you believe that during the late 70s, early 90s, there was a great Black flight in the Black community? The person calls them Nickelmore folks.
What was that last term?
The person said, I call them the Nickelmore folks.
And asked me, was there a Black flight? I think yes, in terms of flight, in terms of moving from inner city out to suburbs. I think flight events, and I think we still see that. And I think I talked about that as part of the gentrification strategy. I think we have to really rethink that, because when we do that, then the people who have reached a point where they can leave the community obviously have a certain amount of success. And those are the people who need to be proximal to people in the community who are still striving to get to that level. And when you leave the community, you surround yourself by people who don't need to be inspired by you when you go out to suburbia. You need to stay in the city where people can see you. So I think we have had that flight. And that's been a common phenomenon over the years. Because that's part of our Black folks feeling like they've arrived. When you reach a point where you make enough money and you feel like you've got some investments, you want to show that you have made it. You want to look the part of success. Staying in the inner city doesn't necessarily do that for you, but moving out into a big sprawling house in suburbia does. And so that's part of that psyche that we have to deal with. I think that's part of our healing. We have to not worry so much about that. We got to think about what's in the best interest of our community in terms of where we go. And if we stay, that helps our community. You still have the resources, you still have whatever wealth you have in prosperity, but you don't have to show it based on where you live necessarily.
Thank you. Lakia?
Yes, we actually have another question that came through, but I'm going to go back to the third question. Would you speak on the lack of respect and value that those who serve our communities demonstrate? Many of them are of the same race.
Many of them are?
Of the same race.
Lack of respect. And this says of those who serve our community.
Yes.
Okay.
It's a hard one to answer. And
yeah.
I don't think, I think there is the...
law enforcement? What are we talking about? Public servants?
They weren't specific.
Yeah.
Well, I know that respect is a commodity that we have that's not as... I look at my own kids, particularly my son, who's a very disciplined young man, 23 years old, graduate in the United States Air Force Academy. But I look at him, and my wife and I have this conversation all the time. With all that he's done, he's not still, even though he's respectful, not as respectful of us as his parents as my wife and I were of our parents.
You think it's respect or fear?
Yeah, the definition of respect is different. I mean, so I'm constantly telling this 23-year-old, look, this is how you talk to people, and this is how you address people, and he knows it. And I don't get any complaints about him being disrespectful, but my perspective is that he's just not nearly as respectful as I was when I was his age. And I'm trying to figure out, where did we go wrong, because I'm the one that raised him. And my wife, the two of us. So how did that happen? I think it's just they're a different generation. Mm-hmm. And they're so independent now. And they're so much smarter than we were. The brain power and the options they have, and the decisions they have to deal with, and the stressors and the environment they have to deal with. Life is more complicated. So I think all that has to be taken into account. But I do think we have seen a diminishing of respect, at least in my estimation, based on what I'm accustomed to, and I'm a little bit old school. But I think it's okay as long as he's successful. So.
One more question. Dr. Lewis, the thought of the young man being a young rapper never crossed your mind?
No, not too much. He could have been. Yeah, he could have been. Right. That's the problem with cognitive schemas and stereotypes. Even me, who talks about those things all the time, I was at that moment on autopilot, and I didn't have the wherewithal to pull myself back and think, okay, Alan, you know about these things, so don't jump to this conclusion. Maybe there's another explanation for him having the money. I didn't do that because my subjective reality is that the way he dressed, his age, his assumptive forms, the car, the bling, and all that stuff, and the money was synonymous with being a drug dealer. It could have been a rapper, could have been, but that was my feeling. Absolutely, and that's a great point. Mm-hmm. But that illustrates how we go through life on autopilot. You got to, and sort of subconsciously dealing with these things, and jumping to conclusions and making judgments all the time. Even people who talk about these things all the time, like I do, fall into the same trap. Absolutely. I always say we're all always going to still be human, no matter how much education and experience and whatever else we have. We are all always going to still be human beings, which means we're not going to be perfect.
Okay. Dr. Wilson, did you have any more questions?
No, just that to thank you again. This has really been a really interesting conversation. It's covered so much. So I want to thank everyone for allowing me to be part of it.
Dr. Salatu?
Thank you. Yeah, you probably didn't want to ask another question, Dr. Wilson, because you don't want me to ramble like I did on your last one, right?
Well, it was a big question.
I just have it.
Surprised that nobody's asked about what's going on right now in terms of police stuff and all that, but that's fine.
Please, Dr. Salatu.
Well, I mean, we are out of time, but I can add one little comment, which is all these are realities, but we have to have at least some little wins, right? We have to win something little by little, so that in the next 100 years, we can make the transition that you talked about, which is we will have a more integrated society, not segregated society, right? And one of the ways to achieve that goal would be to begin the process of actually reducing stereotypes.
Yes.
And reducing the biases, and also reducing implicit bias.
Oh yeah.
I mean, explicit is fine. If somebody tells you, hey, you are too short, that's explicit. You don't have to do anything about it. If the law doesn't allow it, the law will take care of it.
Right.
But it is the implicit nature of the biases that creates significant problems. And I think if we could find a way to educate people, the reality is that we cannot go back and reconstruct what happened in the past, but we can teach people how to avoid the implicit biases, or at least be conscious about them so that they'll be less in society. And then with that, I think we can achieve a more integrated society as we move forward. That would be my comment.
Absolutely. And speaking of bias, I do have some strategies in that chapter in my book about bias that talk about how do you manage personal bias. And implicit bias is all about the expectations we have around things in terms of what our past experience has been. So there are some processes that if we are intentional and systematic, we can really make sure that we're a little more careful in managing our biases rather than being on just that autopilot. But I was on autopilot when I was behind the guy in Wendys. And so I think I said it when I was telling the story. I said that my biases and my subjective reality kicked in, and I arrived at this conclusion. I think that's going to happen, but then what you have to do is you got to say, okay, that was the natural part of who I am in terms of those autopilot. But now let me pull back, which is what I do in training counselors when I used to teach counseling. I actually developed a tool that allows you to explore who somebody is in certain dimensions, because you're going to make those snap immediate judgments based on the stimulus that you have. But then you say, okay, this guy might just like to dress this way. He's probably a Rhodes Scholar. And you got to collect the data to confirm that rather than going with whatever your initial reaction was. So, yeah.
Okay, sounds good. It's
Yeah.
exactly 5:30.
5:30, sorry. And I went on to my little talk. Thank you very much, everybody who participated, and reach out if you have further observations and comments and what have you. Thank you again, everybody. I really love this opportunity.
I'd like to thank our audience for joining us this evening. And this is like a critically important topic. I'm sure that there may be questions that you have beyond the time frame in which we're operating. So again, if you have questions, if you would like the book, if you would like the PDF, please email lakia.maxwell@downstate.edu.
I have gotten a lot of emails.
Okay. All right. And the panel, if you would stay on for a few moments.
Thank you again.